This is Professor Stefano Mancuso. For over 30 years he has been studying plant behavior, and much of his work is centered around what he calls plant intelligence. When you first hear this, you're probably thinking that this sounds absurd. After all, plants don't even have brains or anything that even resembles a nervous system, so how could they possibly have any form of intelligence? Yet through decades of experiments, he has found that plants are able to actively sense their surroundings and adjust their behavior depending on what information they receive. He has even found evidence for their capacity to learn. Now at this point, most people will probably be quite skeptical because how do you even go about proving any of this? Well, let's take a look together at how all of this first began. For as far as Stefano could remember, he grew up in a world full of plants. And not just full in the conventional sense, but rather his entire house was flooded with plants, where space for everything else was very limited. This was largely thanks to his mother, who absolutely loved plants. And growing up in this weird world, he slowly began developing an interest for them too. At school, when teachers showed photos of different animals, other kids would ask about lions or elephants, but he was always curious about the walls and walls of plants in every photo. The plants that no one else seemed to see. This fascination stayed with him into college, where he began to study plants seriously. And the more he studied them, the more he was fascinated by how they lived alongside us, yet seemed to exist in a completely different world. And as he was studying for his doctorate, Stefano came across descriptions of how plant roots were said to navigate obstacles underground. The literature at the time mentioned that a root would first run into an obstacle, then slowly feel its way around it in a series of little jumps. This may not seem fascinating to others, but it absolutely captivated him, and he wanted to set up an experiment to study this phenomenon. Little did he know, this experiment would change his perspective on plants forever. So next, let's take a look together at what he found. Stefano's experiment began with a very simple design. He would first place a large obstacle in the soil before planting the seed of a bean plant directly on top. Next, he would wait for the roots to grow while taking notes on what he saw. As the days passed, the roots grew closer and closer to the barrier. And just as he thought he was about to see them come into contact, something unexpected happened. The roots started growing sideways long before they encountered any kind of physical resistance. And this made him very angry because he wanted to observe the little jumps and he couldn't figure out what he had done wrong. And so he repeated the experiment again, and again, and again. Over hundreds of experiments, he tried different materials, different depths, and yet the roots always seemed to avoid the obstacle before ever encountering it. Until one day, it occurred to him that maybe he had been thinking about this all wrong.
A un certo punto è stata una specie di illuminazione. Ho detto, ma non vedrò mai i saltelli, perché la radice conosce, sa dov'è l'ostacolo. E quindi non fa questa cosa che io sto cercando di vedere, ma gira prima. E in effetti è quello che fa una radice.
It was in this moment that he truly fell in love with plants. And he couldn't help but wonder if there was more to what plants were capable of than we gave them credit for. Over the next several years, Stefano spent long stretches in the lab, running experiment after experiment, watching and learning how plants responded to the world around them. And the more he studied them, the harder it became to see them as just passive things. He found that plants could detect pathogens and pick up signals from their environment in ways we barely notice. Then one day, whilst he was observing a parasitic plant called the cuscuta slowly reach for its host, he saw something that felt strangely familiar. The plant seemed to move as though it already had some sense of where the host was, even before making contact. And that brought him back to the same mystery from his doctoral work. How could a plant know what was around it without any of the senses we normally rely on, like sight or touch? This time, he decided to pursue this further and see how far it really went. See, in previous situations, one could argue that perhaps the host plant was giving off chemical signals or that the roots were simply responding to conditions in the soil. So what happens when you remove both those possibilities? He began by placing the seed of a bean plant in a small pot at the center of his lab. Next, he would place a metal support a few meters away. If the plant had no idea of its surroundings, then it should search randomly around the room. But let's take a look together at what he found. This is footage from Stefano's lab. The footage is sped up over several days, but you can see that rather than searching randomly, the bean plant seems to have a very good idea of where the support is. And if you look closely, the tip of the bean shoot has also preemptively formed into a hook-like shape, and all of this has happened before ever making physical contact.
Another try, and it's not enough. And you can almost feel, no, the effort. And look at the leaves now that they reach the support. How is much quiet, calm. Anyway, so we know that the bean is aware of the pole. Okay.
Over the next few weeks, Stefano repeated the experiment time and time again. He would try moving the support to different locations in the room, but each time the bean plants always seemed to know where the support was. And before long, a more complex question began to take shape in his mind. Were the plants only detecting where the nearest support was, or were they perhaps capable of even more? See, in the wild, plants are rarely alone, so would their behavior change if there were other plants nearby? So for his next experiment, he decided to place two plants side by side with a support beam in between. If the plants were just detecting the nearest support they could find, then they should both grab onto the beam. But let's take a look at what Stefano found. The first phase is what Stefano calls the sensing phase, where they begin to detect what's in their surroundings. Once they realize there's a pole, they quickly try to move towards it, but pay very close attention to what happens when the first plant reaches the pole. Rather than latching on, the second plant suddenly changes direction instead.
You can repeat this experiment 100 times, and 100 times you will get the same result. So this means that the second plant is not just aware of the support, is also aware of another plant and is aware of what the other plant is able to do.
He would later repeat this experiment with plants that were either related or unrelated, and what he found was that when the plants weren't related, the one that lost would typically search for alternatives before giving up eventually. While if they were related, the two plants would instead share the support beam together. This type of kinship behavior has also been found in similar studies across different plants by other scientists. This suggests that they are not only aware of what's in their surroundings, but are actively altering their behavior based on the broader context of the situation itself. Now, this is pretty amazing, right? And when Stefano realized this, he started to think about what all of this really meant. Because if plants were altering their behavior based on complex contextual information, is it possible that they may even have some form of intelligence? As the days went by, this question kept coming up in Stefano's mind. And one day, as he was thinking about what intelligence really meant, he came across a talk by theoretical physicist Michio Kaku, who described learning as one of the clearest signs of intelligence. And that's when he had an idea. He wanted to try and teach a plant something new. For this experiment, he decided to use a plant called Mimosa pudica. These plants have a very unique defense mechanism. When physically disturbed, they'll rapidly close their leaves in response. So Stefano wanted to see if he could get the Mimosa pudica plants to stop reacting to a stimulus that it previously considered to be dangerous. To test this, the plants were first placed in small containers mounted on the vertical rail. They would then be lifted to a height of around 15 centimeters, which was the distance that had already been shown to reliably trigger leaf closure without actually harming the plant. Next, he would drop the plants from this height and observe their behavior. And sure enough, the plants would quickly close their leaves as expected. He would then wait for the plant to reopen its leaves before repeating this again. By around the fifth or sixth time, he already started noticing a change in how the plants would respond, with some plants beginning to reopen their leaves more quickly. And the more he did this, the more the response from the plants weakened, and eventually they stopped closing their leaves altogether.
Toc. La prima volta che cade la pianta si spaventa e chiude tutte le foglie. Poi passa un po' di tempo e si riapre e noi la facevamo ricadere e di nuovo si chiudeva. Si riapriva le foglie e di nuovo la facevamo cadere. Dopo 4-5 volte la pianta capisce che non è pericoloso quello stimolo e non si chiude più. Ha imparato a distinguere fra uno stimolo pericoloso e uno stimolo non pericoloso.
Now, those of you who are perceptive might think, well, maybe the plants were just exhausted from closing their leaves so many times. Stefano thought the same thing. So after dropping them hundreds of times, he immediately introduced them to a second, slightly different stimulus. Instead of dropping them, he would shake the container lightly instead, and this time the plants immediately closed their leaves. Stefano believed that the reason why they're able to learn so quickly is because closing their leaves not only takes a lot of energy, it also reduces the amount of light they're able to absorb. So being able to learn and differentiate between how dangerous different stimuli are would give them a clear survival advantage in nature. But this raised a bigger question. If the reason for their behavior is based on their need for light, would their ability to learn vary if they were raised in different environments? So for his next experiment, Stefano would raise one group of plants in a low light setting and the other with bright light. He would then put them through the same training, and what he found was very interesting. The group that was raised in the low light environment would learn to reopen their leaves much quicker than those in the high light environment. This suggests that in environments where resources are scarce, the cost of closing the leaves becomes much higher, making it more critical to be able to quickly differentiate when a stimulus was actually harmless. He would later switch the environments for the two groups and let them sit for a while before testing them again. He suspected that the plants would be able to quickly adapt to their new environment and exhibit the behaviors that the previous group did. But what he found was even more interesting. Because while this was the case for the group that was raised in bright light, this wasn't the case for the low light group who instead retained their learned behavior. And this is fascinating because their learned behavior still proves to be especially useful in the new environment because it now affords maximum foraging opportunity and it suggests that the plants were able to distinguish between which learned behaviors would continue to be useful. And not just that, they were able to retain these learnings for almost 2 months.
Dopodiché, quando ha imparato che quello stimolo non è pericoloso, noi abbiamo preso le piante, le abbiamo messe in una serra e le abbiamo lasciate 2 mesi. Siamo tornati dopo 2 mesi, le abbiamo sottoposte allo stesso stimolo e la pianta non si chiudeva ancora, cioè ricordava la lezione.
Stefano's research showed that plants not only have some form of memory, but are even able to learn and quickly adapt their behavior to different stimuli. But here's the thing. Plants don't have brains. So what exactly was making this possible? And as Stefano pondered this question, he wondered if they may have some kind of internal system, similar to our own, that was allowing them to perform these complex behaviors. All his life, Stefano had been told that plants were just responding reactively to the world around them. Yet his research findings over the years had shown him something very different. From their ability to detect and change their actions based on what was around them, and even their ability to learn, all of it pointed to the idea that there was something far more complex inside these organisms. And that's when he had a crazy idea. In animals, anesthetic can temporarily shut down the processes that allow an organism to perceive and respond to its surroundings. So what happens if you give anesthetic to a plant? For this experiment, he needed plants that would give off a clear visual signal in response to stimuli, and he chose 5 different plants. We will mainly focus on our friend the Mimosa pudica and the Venus flytrap, but all the plants ended up having similar results. Let's first take a look at how the plants respond before any anesthetic is applied. This is the actual footage from the experiment that Stefano ran, and you can see that both the Mimosa pudica and the Venus flytrap respond almost immediately when they're touched. Next, he would create an anesthetic solution and have this slowly evaporate and be absorbed by the plants in a gas container. And then came the most important part. If the way plants worked was anything like animals, then they should no longer respond to stimuli. And when he tested this, that's exactly what he found. In this instance, despite being touched repeatedly, the plants don't have any response. Finally, he would remove the gas container and leave the plants alone to see if they would recover over time. And it turns out that different plants would take different amounts of time to fully recover. He later finds that their speed of recovery seems to be directly correlated to their ability to produce action potentials, which are brief electrical signals that cells use to transmit information. The same type of signals that animals use to transmit information through the nervous system. This suggests that how plants function may be far more similar to us and other animals, and Stefano believes that they may even have some form of consciousness itself.
Nelle piante di sicuro non sappiamo dov'è, ma le piante sono coscienti. Beh, sai la coscienza come la si definisce? Non lo sappiamo cosa sia la coscienza, sappiamo però che è una cosa che perdiamo quando siamo sotto anestesia o quando dormiamo. In questi due momenti noi non siamo coscienti. Allora la cosa interessante è che le piante possono essere anestetizzate, cioè funzionano gli stessi anestetici che funzionano negli animali funzionano nelle piante e dormono, cioè hanno un ciclo giorno-notte esattamente come il nostro.
Stefano has often wondered if we're too narrow-minded about how we perceive intelligence. For a very long time, we have tended to associate intelligence with things that feel familiar to us. We try to look for a brain or the ability to make choices that look visible and immediate, and in doing so, we assume that if something is truly intelligent, then it must act in ways that resemble us. But plants suggest another possibility, that life can solve problems in slower, quieter ways. They don't display traditional signs of intelligence like birds or dolphins, and yet they've survived on this planet for hundreds of millions of years. They've helped build the very atmosphere we breathe, they've even learned to harvest light, and have cooperated with fungi and bacteria to turn a once hostile world into one that could sustain life, like ours. To Stefano, that is hard to describe as anything less than intelligence. And over time, he came to feel that this was too important to remain locked away in scientific papers read only by other specialists. He wanted to bring this hidden world of plants into public view, which is why he began writing and speaking more publicly about his research. He has even helped build and popularize the field of plant neurobiology, and in doing so, has become one of the most outspoken and controversial public voices. Some critics felt he was going too far, that his language was too provocative and too willing to blur the line between plants and animals. But perhaps Stefano's point was never really about whether plants were intelligent in the way that animals are, but rather if we had made ourselves incapable of seeing intelligence in any form that did not resemble our own. Because when Stefano looks out into the forest, he sees a vast, quiet intelligence at work. A world that has been sensing and evolving all around us for far longer than we have been here to notice it. And that is part of why Stefano believes we would be wise to learn from plants. Because if one day we hope to build a more sustainable future, whether here on Earth or somewhere far beyond it, then perhaps we should pay more attention to the very organisms that have already spent hundreds of millions of years learning how to survive in even the most difficult places. So the next time you walk through a forest, or a garden, or even just watering your own plants at home, it may be worth looking a little more closely, because the world around us may be far more active and alive than we were ever taught to see.